Well, thank you so much. I've just really enjoyed my time here so far. It's just been, I've learned so much. And I'm not gonna lie, I was definitely one of those people who was Googling whenever you guys were talking about the hodag. And am I even pronouncing that correctly? My southern accent may be getting in the way, but thank you all so much. Thank you all who are here in the room and online that's braving the elements here. I'm just really going to be really brief and kind of talk a little bit about kind of how the Federal Reserve kind of approaches this conversation around rural and economic development. But before I begin, I really am grateful to Paul Mitchell for the invitation and opportunity to present rural development resources from the Federal Reserve, which is an area that's really near and dear to my heart. Having grown up in a small town in Arkansas, I have an affinity for the people and places that make up rural America. I'm one of those girls who, whenever going to high school, after I graduated, I hightailed it out of there. And I was like, I'm never returning back to my small little rural community. I'll see you all later. But as I thought about wanting to grow a family and where I wanted my family to live, it really is a place where I thought about wanting to return. And so really being able to do that work at the Fed and really understand that has just been really a big part of the work that I've been able to enjoy. Let me see if I can find the clicker. Okay. Um, so if you have seen anyone from the Federal Reserve speak before, you have seen this disclaimer. So before I get into an overview about our work and how we utilize our rural framework, the information, analysis, and conclusions set forth are my own and do not necessarily indicate concurrence by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, or the Federal Reserve System. So mention or display of a trademark or anything like that do not constitute an endorsement or criticism by the Federal Reserve System and does not imply approval to the exclusion of other suitable products or services. So if there's anything good that you hear, well, that's me. I'm taking credit. And if there's anything that you hear was like, oh, I don't know about that, well, ask my colleague David here with the Chicago Fed, and he'll be able to set you back on the right track. But really, so the Federal Reserve, if you're not already familiar with our work, we are the central bank of the United States. We have responsibility for monetary policy, which you can think about as maintaining full employment or maximum employment in the United States, as well as maintaining stable prices. So happy that Steve was able to outline a good bit of that economic data earlier today. I am not an economist, so you will not be seeing any of that. I may have one or two graphs just because, but really here I'm just kind of tell a little bit of a few stories. And we also are responsible for supervision and regulation of banks and payment systems. So you are really trying to make sure or ensure in a couple of ways that the money that is kept in banks, that they remain secure and that also that banks are being responsive to consumers. So by ensuring there's fair access to credit, that banks are meeting their obligations on the Community Reinvestment Act, which is essentially asking them to invest in or lend to or provide services back into the community at a proportionate rate that they're receiving deposits from their community. And many people are unaware or may not realize one of our other main functions is around community development, which is we're working really hard to really be able to think about and promote economic resiliency and mobility for low and moderate income communities and underserved individuals and communities. So in a way we really think about that is around the economic growth. So we know that economic growth doesn't always happen proportionately in every neighborhood or in every region or even in every household. And just because the economy may be booming in one area, it doesn't mean that that everyone is able to experience that boom. And so we're really looking at what are the drivers or opportunity that might be able to help communities look into or maybe investigate or pursue that really could help economic resilience and mobility for individuals and families. And so why rural development is important to the Fed, we know how critical rural communities are to the economy, hence why we're all here today. And it's been really demonstrated really greatly already throughout some of these economic updates and through the panel earlier. And so we know that's an integral part of our national economy, that our national security, as well as our identity. And so a large share of the land area is considered rural. and that around, depending on your definition, around 45 million people, or at least 14% of the US population, considers rural home. And furthermore, without the critical contributions of our rural communities, many aspects of even suburban and urban communities and economies would not be possible. And so we know that having and being able to understand those incentives and developing a better understanding of how we create a better opportunity for rural households, businesses, and communities can be even illustrated in a recent publication, multimedia publication that we recently published through Fed Communities, through our Fed Communities website. And so when we even think about the economies of rural and urban regions, we know that whenever they're integrated really well, that they both can be able to perform better. And even whenever one only functions well on its own. So as a nation, it's really important that we recognize how both economies are linked to each other's success and the overall economy. And from careful review of previous and current research and meeting with rural stakeholders and practitioners, we have to understand that rural communities are more likely to be successful in fostering broad-based economic prosperity if they take an asset-based, equitable approach to their development activities, which we heard from our panelists earlier, in which that has been taking place here in Wisconsin. And so we call it the trick. It's really nice little acronym to kind of sum up how we think about that framework. And so back in 2021, we published Investing in Rural Prosperity, looking at this framework, which really works to inform our rural development stakeholders how policies, as well as practices and funding streams at the local, state, and federal level can help support the achievement of shared economic prosperity. And so we wanted to not only do that by looking at these practices as well as funding streams, but also be able to have a place where success is happening, right? So we talked a little bit about where those successes are seeing, where we're seeing those successes happen. And so we put together a series, not only within the book, you'll find several case studies within there too to show and highlight where success is happening. And being able to do that in a way where we're able to celebrate what's worked in our rural areas. And so the book is kind of really organized around this framework you see from my colleagues Andrew DeMont at the Federal Reserve Board, as well as Daniel Davis with the St. Louis Fed, where they proposed this framework. And so we believe that while every community may have assets to build on, we're aware that simply having those assets is just not enough or sufficient condition for shared economic prosperity. It really takes what we were seeing, what Beth was talking about with your work, being able to coordinate that, being able to convene and convert those presence of those assets into economic prosperity that is felt by the whole community. And so to do that important work, we really look at focus specifically on rural communities. While it really focuses on rural communities, we also believe that this approach is applicable to folks who are here in Madison or even in our suburban context as well. And so really thinking about it being collaborative, you see the rings kind of intersect as well. And so collaborative and tailored. Rural development is truly tailored when the needs and opportunities of the community are identified through a collaborative process. And so to be effective as possible, partners in collaboration need to be tailored to the specific community context. And so what I'm hearing from a lot of rural communities within just my area is that we can't copy and paste what has worked in one community and set those same conditions and being able to have a program and copy it and paste and think it'll happen into another community, right? We already heard from our other Maria and talking about how they work and how you have to really be having that to be tailored. We also have to have collaborative and inclusive processes. So true inclusion is collaborative, and that involves inviting all groups to the table. Even my curmudgeon of an uncle who may not want to be involved and thinks nothing good is gonna happen here, I still gotta invite him to the table, right? He still has to be a part of that process. And so really looking at ways to listen to their perspectives and incorporating their ideas. So the best collaborations, right, are inclusive and they create shared leadership and power. So we can't just do it in a way where there's a tokenism behind it that, hey, we wanted to check mark these people off the list to say that they're involved. It has to be a part more inclusive to where there's power shared and being put at the table. It also has to be collaborative and resilient. And so to truly be resilient, a rural development plan must be developed through, again, collaboration is I think the key and the theme here, and that is carried forward, and that those are intentionally considered how to keep the partners together over time, right? So we come together, we have a planning grant to being able to do these dollars, to being able to understand what we need to do. You put together a plan, a report. It may sit on a table, it may not, but in order for it to be truly resilient, we try to talk through the book and show and highlight case studies where communities are actually saying, no, we don't want that strategic process to sit on the table. We actually need to continue to keep leaders engaged. And so what is a process that we need to develop in our community to ensure that all people are engaged and they're engaged over time? It also has to be tailored as well as inclusive and resilient. So resilience necessitates being inclusive so that future community leaders help develop the plan as a result and are committed to it. Furthermore, rural communities cannot be resilient if their most vulnerable residents remain at risk, right? So if you're saying, okay, the same 10 people, right? Some of our communities I've worked with in the past have the STP problem, right? The same 10 people. And so whenever that happens, it's great because you have the leadership, you know who's being a part of that process. But what happens over time is that those that were not included may not say, well, our community, nothing's changing. It's always the same people. I don't see any progress that's happened because they weren't originally included in the process in the beginning. And so how can you be able to create a way where it's both inclusive as well as resilient? So all people say, no, no, no. You were at this meeting at this time, you were part of this event, and you continuously keeping them engaged in the way in which they want to see themselves engaged. And so again, we have this publication. It's a free publication. I'll provide a link to where you can be able to download that, not just that, but other resources. But it's over 600 pages long. In the true Fed fashion, we converted over like 80 authors and brought all their great and brightest. But for those of you here and online, I've been able to look through it, and we come away with a few key takeaways to really kind of look through where we're seeing some change happening and some of the big takeaways. So in that, and we so glad for your work, Bat. You kind of already discussed this around some of the demographic changes that's happening in rural communities. And so population declines in some rural areas, gain in others, resulting in virtually no net growth in rural areas overall over the last decade. Yet America's rural and small towns have experienced substantial racial and ethnic changes since 1990, as highlighted in one of our chapters by Kenneth Johnson and Dan Lichter. And so they really look at analyzing the Hispanic population in areas that have experienced chronic outmigration. And so looking here at 2019, we see that 78% of the non-metro population was identified as non-Hispanic, while between 1990 and 2019, the non-metro Hispanic population nearly doubled in size. And so not only is this an area that we're seeing overall in the US, but also in the Great Lakes region. I know that the Urban Institute has already also looked at some of the Great Lakes demographic changes that are happening and what's being done there. Second is that local rural capacity requires community-based organizations. And community-based organizations, we know, are something that's required, that has to be local, right? That has to be members within the community being a part of that process. And that's where you're gonna see real capacity. Because a lot of times we talk a lot about capacity, but sometimes it's really a bandwidth, right? A level of resources, being able to take on that. Like, while you have a mayor that may be dealing with roads and sewers and water quality and challenges there, you also need to have community-based organizations that are part of that, to being able to really think through some of these areas. And so in one of the chapter, they kind of outline some 6 ways to kind of build that. So looking at organizational capacity, a lot of times those community-based organizations are going to be folks who are from that community, who know the players, who can walk up to somebody's doorstep and say, hey, I need this person to be a part of this conversation, how to be able to know what levers to pull and what levers to meet, to being able to meet whether you have a state or local or federal opportunity coming into that community. So rural entrepreneurship, we know that rural counties have a higher rate of self-employed self-employed business proprietors in metro areas. So this is an area to celebrate, right? While rural entrepreneurship or this is really Tessa's lane, really, and somebody that I go to just to understand and hear what's happening there. We know that these entrepreneurs hire others in their community, they create new jobs, and this constant churn of pursuing new ideas and opportunities really creates community vibrancy. And so really not just vibrancy, but that livability. I think you talked a little bit too about that, Matt, around what's happening in this space as well. Next is a significant factor in the difference between recovery and resiliency is the leadership in place to support a community's transformation from its past to its future. And so a lot of times whenever I'm going out talking with communities, a lot of times they'll say, well, what is your biggest asset in your community, right? And they always say the people. And it really takes leadership within that community. So you'll have communities not only looking at leadership there, but then also thinking about the future leadership. So building out these youth leadership programs to being able to be good stewards of the resources that are in their communities and what that takes. And like, again, I said, like mayors and your local officials, they have a myriad of issues and challenges. But really having and creating that professional staff is of critical need in a lot of our small rural communities. Someone who's waking up every day and their main focus is really thinking about the economic growth, the resiliency of their community. And so what are some ways in which they can be thinking about that, fostering that? How can they engage others and other organizations within that process? And not just thinking about state and federal local dollars or even that, but like how you laid out the capital frameworks, there's other ways to where we need to think about and broaden the conversation around investment. And so that really brings me to rural communities. Yeah, our people are our greatest assets, but we also need access to capital to thrive. And capital, financial capital, we need cold, hard cash. But a lot of times we were just talking, right? The cash is not always the challenge. It's not always the issue. And so what are the ways in which we can be able to kind of think about that and identify that and think about the gaps? Because it not only looks at what a community is able to do, but it also leads to having not access to a lot of this. Also leads to, like what Marie is talking about, those social determinants of health and chronic issues and health issues as well. So what are some ways that we can kind of think about that per capita with engaging philanthropies and others within these areas to kind of increase access to capital in our rural communities is also a big takeaway from this publication that we have. And so I definitely encourage you to download the book. Like I said, it's not just this book there, but we also have other resources. We have webinars. We also have expertise and analysis where you can engage and talk directly with those leaders. Please reach out to me. I'm easy to find online. If there's somebody in which you want to connect with, I'll be here all day as well. So feel free to come and say hello and as we grab a glass of wine, or I hear Wisconsin has really great beer, so looking forward to that as well.